is gaining momentum, yet simultaneously Black and brown people, poor and working class people, trans and gender nonconforming people, disabled people, and others targeted by state violence are facing continued attack. And I'm going to pause for a moment here. Okay, great. I hope you all can hear me now. Wonderful. Okay, so for those of you who haven't been able to hear, I was just introducing the AbolitionNOW Network, convened by Critical Resistance. And our current partners are the Red Nation, BYP 100, Song, Black Visions, Reclaim the Block, Drum, Survived and Punished, All of Us or None, LSPC, and Critical Resistance. So we can go to the next slide, please, the one with the definitions. So, before we dive into things, what are these words we're saying? What is PIC? So PIC stands for Prison Industrial Complex. And PIC is a term that we use to describe the overlapping interests of government and industry that use surveillance, policing, and imprisonment as solutions to the economic, social, and political problems. Abolition. So PIC, or Prison Industrial Complex Abolition, is a political vision with the goal of eliminating imprisonment, policing, and surveillance, and creating lasting alternatives to punishment and imprisonment. And finally, what's policing? So policing is a little bit broader than we think. Policing is a social relationship made up of a set of practices that are empowered by the state to enforce law and social control through the use of force. So that sets the stage a little bit for us today. And now we're going to move in, diving in more around the origins in settler colonialism, racial capitalism, and imperialism. And I'm going to turn it over to Lou.
Thank you, Sheila. Hi, everybody. As you know, my name is Lou. I'm calling today from Lenape-Hoking, also known as Brooklyn, my apartment. I am a member of the Red Nation, as well as a chairperson for the East Coast Freedom Council, which is kind of a wide regional freedom council at the moment of the Red Nation. I am Dene from Arizona. I'm Dene on my mother's side, and kind of a Anglo-Irish mess on my father's side. So today I've been asked to talk about colonization, right? A very long, complicated, epic history. So I'm not going to be simplifying necessarily, but trying to zero in on some key themes today, and also focusing mostly on the period from the late 19th century to broaching the present day. Because, right, there were several different colonial European nations who've left their marks on the Americas, but I'm going to be talking specifically about the United States and its consolidation as an imperial power, first through westward expansion. So I've been asked to cover sort of three main topics, and we'll see how much of all of those I can get to. But first, we're going to be talking about the enclosure of land and the displacement of indigenous people that follows that enclosure and their replacement by settlers. So this is often understood as the logic of elimination that animates settler colonialism. And I'm going to be focusing mostly on how that is achieved in part through the imposition of private property. Second, I'm going to be talking about the creation of reservations, as well as the taking of Native prisoners of war in military forts, and how this legacy continues in federal prisons. And lastly, the repression of indigenous resistance, which happened alongside, right, the response to slave revolts, but also just any kind of unauthorized movements of Black people, and how that was maintained through militias, as well as the U.S. military. So I think we're looking at the colonization slide, I hope. It should say colonization, seizing the lands, disappearing the people. And in the background of that, you can see a map from, I think it's 1939, that I took from the Library of Congress, of different Indian reservation lands. So just from that image alone, right, you can see that this entire continental mass, which was at one point all indigenous land, being broken up into these reservations. So what happens when that land is settled, and how does this settlement happen? One big event in that long history comes in 1887, the Dawes Act. The Dawes Act authorized breaking up tribal lands, partitioning them into individual plots, and then whatever was left over from those individual plots, right, was sort of up for grabs. And the rub here was that those Native people who did not accept the individual, or those who did accept the individual allotments, were allowed to become U.S. citizens. So just from that one act, we can see very clearly how the breaking up of land is very much tied to destroying systems of governance and ways of organizing life writ large, right? And also then trying to assimilate people into a foreign form of governance by becoming U.S. citizens. So there's a whole destructive force that's unleashed there that breaks up all the social relations that exist between a people and the land, and how that relationship structures their relationships with each other. So when land is made into property, when it's seen as something that can be commodified, bought, and sold, there's a whole new sort of set of relations that come into play there. And I think most clearly what we see in the Dawes Act is this kind of individualization, that you can become a citizen, a rights-bearing citizen, because you have this one little partitioned piece of land, as opposed to a more communal system in which there's something like the commons, right, that is not determined by market values or anything like that, and that people are accessing according to very different, what many indigenous people formulate as types of kinship. So all of these are majorly disrupted when the land is made into property. And this is what Marx describes, right, as primitive accumulation, primitive meaning like primary, the first. And that primitive accumulation is accumulation by dispossession. And this is the violence of capitalism to Marx, but also from this analysis of settler colonialism, right, of capitalist colonialism. And in the settler colony, we see that this violence, this primitive accumulation, doesn't just happen once; it's ongoing. So this is part of the story of westward expansion, where more and more sites are being cleared. Indigenous people are being cleared from the land, and that land is then made into something that can be commodified. And so this is a continuing violence, and one that often cloaks itself as improvement. Whether that improvement is something like, in the present day, seeing so-called like blighted communities being taken over by eminent domain in order for there to be development, which actually displaces a bunch of people, or in the kind of less maybe accepted narrative, but one that still circulates, right, that colonization improved the lives of indigenous people by bringing them things like, modern infrastructure, as opposed to seeing that as actually a really violent process that destroyed worlds and entire ways of life. So how was this accomplished? Many times just through sheer force. If you've ever driven around the U.S., but particularly in the West, you've probably noticed all of the fort names. I grew up in Arizona. There was many different forts. I went to soccer practice at a fort. Whenever I need to access services through my tribe, I have to get in touch with the people at Fort Defiance, right? So that fort is now on reservation land. 20 of the reservations within the United States have the names of forts that were built there by the U.S. Army. So these forts both held Native people who fought against or simply were in the way of U.S. expansion, but were just kind of that first marker of U.S. presence. Leaders like Sitting Bull and Geronimo are maybe some of the more famous people who were held at military forts during their resistance to U.S. occupation. And we can also see this as part of U.S. imperialism as it moves from the kind of continental domestic spheres, frontier to frontier, then further, like moving overseas, for instance, to Hawaii. if you speak with Native Hawaiians, they describe an atmosphere of total militarization, right? And this is also because the U.S. stages the headquarters of Pacific Command there as their kind of strategic outpost to stage aggression against Asia. So we see, this military presence just spreading wherever settlers are going, wherever land is being opened up to be commodified. And in order to make that happen, indigenous people are being either just straight up killed or sort of assimilated into citizenship, all through dispossession. And let's move to one particular fort, Fort Yuma. If we could go to the next slide, please. So Fort Yuma was a fort in California, literally in a county that's called Imperial County. So you can't really get more blatant than this, right? And it was actually abandoned in the late 19th century, transferred to the Department of the Interior, and then that site, that fort, becomes an Indian school, as it was called, the Fort Yuma Indian School. As well as a mission, right? So if you've driven around California, you know there's like forts and missions dotting the landscape as sort of the two forces that are really helping colonization take place, and beginning to criminalize ways of inhabiting the land that do not fit into the new kind of tyranny of private property. If we can go to the next slide, you will see an image of what this fort looked like while it was an Indian school. And I found this image just really striking for me being a really early example of this American connection between education and incarceration, right? What we now call the school to prison pipeline. And here it's like the school and the prison are one location. So for those who aren't familiar, I won't get into a lot of detail, but there's a history, right, of boarding schools in the United States in which Native youth, Native children were taken from their families and coerced to move into these boarding schools, oftentimes away from their tribal land. So as a way to kind of, again, disrupt the social relations that bridge people to relating to land outside of a propertied relation. So this was an ongoing policy of the United States to take children and put them in boarding schools where education was not really the goal, right? It was that separation and this kind of control. So again, I'm looking at boarding schools as kind of, again, the early example of this school to prison pipeline. Because it's not even a pipeline there, it's really just occupying the same site. And other ways we can see the kind of destruction of colonial policy, and particularly of the kind of individualization that private property calls for in some ways is the criminalization of homelessness, particularly Native homeless people. But we see, the criminalization of homelessness in every major city, minor city, right, throughout the United States. If you are not inhabiting the land properly, you are wrong, rather than the dispossession itself that has made you homeless being wrong. Another way we see this violence being upheld is through law enforcement in border towns, but also just like white civilians in border towns. And when I say border town, I'm referring to cities and towns that exist on the edges of Indian reservations. So, for instance, much of my family is in Gallup, New Mexico. There's just an incredible amount of violence that is allowed to happen there against Native people by both cops, but also by teenagers, right? Just generally white settlers. And again, this is a kind of way of imposing a certain everyday terror on Indigenous people's lives simply for existing near or on their ancestral lands. If we could go to the next slide, please. So this continuum of colonial violence is what I'm calling it, right? We see it every day in the ways in which cops are able to hassle Native people who may be houseless, when we see teens or other white people just like having very violent field days harassing Native people. This is like literally described as a hobby in some border towns, right? And again, this is just one of the ways in which Native people existing on their lands causes them to be targets of this kind of violence. But we also see it in these images on this slide of these maybe might be familiar images to some of us, right, from the No DAPL, No Dakota Access Pipeline struggle at Standing Rock, which was met with coordinated attacks by all levels of law enforcement, right, from local cops, state cops, the National Guard, as well as Tiger Swan, this private military, or this private security force, all with incredible amounts of military gear. And what are they all trying to secure? They're trying to secure corporate access to land. So the continuing ability for them to sell and make a profit on land. And one of the most ridiculous excuses for this kind of thing with pipelines, right, is that this is like some sort of climate solution. So again, we see it framed in the context of improving the land, or at least improving our overall situation for settlers, right? And sort of Indigenous people are seen as the necessary sacrifice to make that happen. And we have very recently, one of the water protectors was freed, but there is still a pattern that I think was established at No DAPL in terms of the kind of state repression of water protectors that has been just the increased criminalization of any kind of protest, peaceful or not, right, that we saw after Ferguson, that we saw this summer after the uprisings, with just incredibly trumped up charges for people and these really protracted legal battles while we're still trying to get Leonard Peltier free, right, from our struggle in the 70s. So this is, in some ways, I think, a bleak story, right? I haven't said the word genocide, but that's a big part of that story as well, right? If you can't assimilate the people, you kill them. If you can't kill them, you assimilate them. These have been sort of the varying tactics of the United States government and its expansion, and those things can't be ignored. But I guess if I were to think about what that also means, it's that it shows just how much effort and how much sheer violence and force it takes for the U.S. to get that far, right? This was not some sort of natural process, that this took an incredible amount of force, and it still does, right? The continuance of that colonial violence takes so much force and so many resources, and it's not complete, right? I'm here, my family's here. Indigenous people are still practicing their ways as stymied as it has been by colonial expansion. So I did want to try to it's not a bright note to end on, but just to think about the fact that this was something that, took so much effort on their end, and it will take a lot of effort to undo. But again, this was not an inevitable process. This was not something that just happened. It took an incredible and a very long period of continual violence that is still ongoing. So we're still living in that colonial period. It didn't end. And as we might hear from later, right, the kind of tactics of what Manu Karuka calls continental imperialism are very similar to then what kind of imperial tactics the U.S. uses abroad. So colonization did not just necessarily affect Indigenous people, but it's something that then kind of takes over the U.S.'s entire orientation to not only Indigenous people, but in many times its own citizens, particularly Black people, but then also those overseas who are not citizens and those who are not citizens within these bounds. So I think I'll end it there for now and look forward to the rest of the conversation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Lou. Thank you, for taking us all the way through that history, and yes, the incredible amount of violence and also the incredible amount of resilience of Indigenous people, right? Thank you so much. So now I'm going to turn it over to Woods Ervin, right, to talk about racial capitalism.
Hello, everyone. My name is Woods Ervin. I use they, them pronouns. and am currently located on Wampanoag land or northeastern Massachusetts. So I'll be reviewing the key development of key moments in U.S. history. Actually, the U.S. Police and imprisonment system as part of developing and strengthening U.S.-based racial capitalism. So I'm going to start with a definition before going into three examples that are going to be anchored in, let's say, two-ish periods. To ground us in the periods I'm going to discuss, I'm going to start with a definition of racial capitalism. To quote Robin D.G. Kelly's 2017 essay about Cedric Robinson's definition of racial capitalism, while writing Black Marxism, Robinson encountered intellectuals in South Africa who used the phrase racial capitalism to refer to South Africa's economy under apartheid. He developed it from a description of a specific system to a way of understanding the general history of modern capitalism. If we can put up the first slide, sorry. Capitalism is an economic system that requires the constant circulation of capital throughout the system, growing more and more capital for capitalists. This system depends on exploitation in order to survive, exploitation of land, resources, people, etc. And in order to justify the difference in exploitation of some people over others, capitalism requires we institute arbitrary hierarchies, race being a fundamental one. A key takeaway is that capitalism has always been racialized. It was as part of its birth in Europe amongst its people. It was as part of colonization and the practice of slavery in the United States. And it is clearly still core to how capitalism functions today. So now I'm going to go into my first period and examples. Next slide, please. The first thing you should be seeing actually are a group of police officers in black and white. Okay, so the period around Reconstruction, 1840s to the 1870s. This period is significant because it is a time in which labor relations dramatically change in the United States due to the emancipation from slavery of Black labor. So a little bit of background. Prior to this period, we have the growth of racialized criminalization with the introduction of curfew laws for all Black and Indigenous people, establishing race as a defining criteria in law enforcement in the new colonies. Many southern cities, including Charleston, New Orleans, and Mobile, had formed paramilitary groups tasked with control of enslaved people to prevent and suppress rebellion. Past laws had been instituted allowing for the arrest of any Black person without a pass, regardless of status. So in 1845, there's the establishment of the first unified and uniformed police force in New York City. So this is only about 150-ish years old. Boston and Philadelphia follow New York City's example. And this the uniformed police force is based on the London Watch model, and as in London, the establishment of police departments in the United States was based on the growth of so-called property crimes. As police in the U.S. began to coalesce into one relatively uniform type, what used the previous law enforcement models like guards, watchmen, militias, and slave patrols began to coalesce into city-run 24-hour police. Next slide, please. So we move to 1865 and the emancipation of enslaved people. Immediately following emancipation, Black workers engage in fights for an expansion of rights and political power. This is all part of Reconstruction. And so Reconstruction and a rapid gain of political power by Black people in the South is met with extreme legal and extra-legal backlash, including violent vigilante and militia action against Black people attempting to vote or run for office. So Southern law enforcement is often indistinguishable from white supremacist vigilante groups. Why this period is significant to policing. The core purpose of policing, to protect property relations, is solidified. The methods of targeting Black and Indigenous people in the US translate over and become part of its functioning as well. So now for the second-ish period. I say ish because it moves right from the first one. So this period is the late 1800s and turn of the century. This period is marked both by the emergence of the United States economic dominance globally, as well as the huge economic crises of the 1920s. So in the late 1800s, as urbanization increases, so does the elite fears of working class rebellion, which in turn drive an expansion of policing. Next slide, please. A concrete and illuminating example of this period is the Haymarket Riots in Chicago. In 1886, workers are organizing for the 8-hour day. There had been several days of intense police repression of workers leading up to a rally that was scheduled for May 4th. Literally on May 3rd, the day before, cops had murdered a few people. So the rally on May 4th was both for the 8-hour day and also against police violence. Cops show up to the rally and a bomb goes off. The cops then begin firing, killing both protesters and police. A group of anarchists and socialists are blamed for the deaths of the police at the rally. And then raids on the activist community ensue, and ultimately eight men are convicted as examples. And 4 of them are murdered by execution. So this example is significant in that it both encapsulates how policing was deployed to stop the gains being made by workers, but also because repression breeds resistance, galvanizing labor movements to fight harder, propelling the movement to win the 8-hour day forward to victory. So throughout the early 20th century, police departments continued to escalate to match the growth in size and power of labor movements. In 1905, the first state police agency is established in Pennsylvania in response to private police forces used by mine and mill owners to stop worker strikes and the inability or refusal of local police to enforce law. So another important example from this period is the Battle of Blair Mountain in Logan County, West Virginia. It was the largest labor uprising in U.S. history since the Civil War. For 5 straight days, from late August to September 1921, around 10,000 armed coal miners confronted 3,000 cops and strike breakers who were backed by coal mine operators during the miners' attempts to unionize the Southwest, the southwestern West Virginia coal fields, when tensions rose between workers and mine management. The battle ended after approximately 1 million rounds were fired, and the U.S. Army, represented by the West Virginia Army National Guard, intervened by presidential order. While this was clearly a huge loss, it was a powerful example of cross-race solidarity as part of labor resistance. It also led to the generation of the largest unions in the United States. As we move into the 1920s and 1930s, IWW and other unions are particularly active. Police are routinely deployed as a shield between corporations and unions, breaking up strikes and threatening labor organizers with violence. State police forces spread as a response to union actions, and large corporations, as you saw, per the examples, sometimes had private police forces, or their own private security forces. But corporations saw this as expensive, and reformers saw this as unsavory. And state troopers become the solution. So by 1930s, every state had some form of a state police agency. So I'm going to close out this period here. The takeaway of this period, an example is, and the two examples is that it demonstrates the way that police have always have and always will stand in direct opposition to the labor movement and its goals. Calls for labor unions and elected representatives to break ties with fraternal order police, which strengthen the fight against policing, as well as the aims of organized labor. So last, for period 3, the late 1970s and 1980s, this period is marked by an economic crisis, the end of the welfare state, mass deindustrialization and deregulation, and the disciplining of labor movements and radical movements in the United States. As background on prisons, I'm going to do a quick paraphrase of Foucault. The practice of putting people in cages for part of all of their lives has been part of the development of modern secular states. Capitalism is an unstable system and prone to crisis. In order to stabilize capitalism and get us to accept it, prisons has been deployed increasingly as a way of social control. Prisons both depersonalized social control so that it could be managed across time and space, and satisfied the demands of reformers who largely prevailed in the fights against corporal punishment or bodily punishment, which still endures with the death penalty and many torturous conditions of confinement. The 1960s demands for radical social and political transformation led to pushback in the name of law and order and the war on crime. The prison became the site for reasserting order and addressing social problems resulting from the excessive liberalization of the 60s. The California prison boom in the 1980s is a strong example in this period. Here I'll paraphrase Ruth Wilson Gilmore's explanation of how California became the state with the most massive prison system in the country, with the most massive prison system in the world. Capitalism necessarily produces surplus, and surplus can lead to crisis. The reasons why the surplus becomes a crisis are not only economic, but political and social. They require constant political organization to solve and resolve. This happens via a struggle of capitalists and those of us it dominates, which is all of us now. As part of the introduction of neoliberal management to resolve the crisis of surplus that started in the 1970s and that we're still dealing with today, leading to the sort of first depression in the 1970s, but hasn't really been resolved since then. Business leaders and politicians needed somewhere to put all of this surplus money, that's the surplus resources that are moving through capitalism. These surplus resources could have gone to more schools under the UC system, or more parks, or any other number of life-generating projects. But instead, due to the aim to further dismantle the welfare state, the desire to suppress the working poor, many of whom were losing work as deindustrialization occurred and factories left, and a demographic shift of more people of color, these resources went into prison because they address these crises in ways that satisfy capitalists, tough on crime politicians, and enough of the middle and working classes, they became the go-to way of addressing problems like this as they manifested again and again. The surplus into prisons, jails, and detention facilities would become a foundational strategy across the country for managing the variety of crises that states were going through as they worked to sort of stabilize neoliberalism. This was only put to like a halt when people from across the state of California fought to stop the building of Delano 2 in the year 2000. While they did lose that fight, it was the last prison built in California to date. So when we fight, we win. The key takeaway here is that the phenomenon, frequently identified as mass incarceration, was driven by economic, political, and social issues that could have been and can still be resolved by other means. So to close in general, as was introduced earlier, the prison industrial complex is used as a means to address political, social, and economic problems. If we're going to build the free and just future that our communities long for, we have to strive to understand the PIC's relationship to racial capitalism, as we work toward PIC abolition. And I'll pass it back to Sheila. Thank you.
Wow. Thank you so much, Woods. I couldn't believe that we would do the history of racial capitalism in 15 minutes, but you did it. All right, now I'm going to turn it over to Mohamed to talk about imperialism and the prison industrial complex.
Awesome. Hello, everyone. Thank you so much, Sheila. And thank you to Lou and Woods for all of that knowledge and that history to really ground us. My name is Mohamed Shehk. I'm with Critical Resistance, and I am joining you all today from Ohlone Land, now also known as Oakland, California. So I am here to talk about the relationship between imperialism and the prison industrial complex. And that is no small task, but I will try my best. So to begin, I want to just go over a definition of imperialism. And this is on the next slide from my title slide. And I'm just going to read the first part of it. Imperialism is a global system whereby the dominant political, economic interests of one nation expropriate for their own enrichment the land, labor, raw materials, and markets of another people. And so in understanding imperialism, this is just for us to be on the same page around the language and understanding that we're using. It is very much tied, inseparable from capitalism and colonialism and its response to crises in those systems, right? We can go to the next slide. So the prison industrial complex, which was laid out in the beginning as the interlocking systems and interests that use policing, imprisonment, and surveillance, are very much caught up in and used by imperialist forces, not just for how they function, within those countries, but also internationally, right? So on the one hand, we have to understand the military, for instance, as part and parcel of the prison industrial complex. It essentially functions, the US military, as the world's policing agency. We are the top cop. And in fact, in kind of drawing on some of the history that Woods was laying out for us, it was the building up of the military-industrial complex through and after the Second World War, in that last phase that Woods was talking about, that laid the conditions for the rise of the prison industrial complex, right? And then on the other hand, as part of this country's imperialist reach, the US exports its model of policing, imprisonment, and the PIC as a whole to different countries. And again, the purpose, as I hope is clear from my former previous speakers, is to contain and control racialized working class people and communities in resistance, right? And so this is exactly why, after neoliberal policies were waged on third world countries for decades, we began to see a dramatic rise in the PIC in those same countries. So I have here a slide up that you can see. I think that maybe the slides may have gotten a little bit out of order, but that's okay. John, if you can go to the slide that has the case study, Plan Colombia, that would be great. So if we look at Latin America as an example, so Colombia at one point was one of the most unequal countries where inequality was the highest across Latin America. It is still among the most unequal countries in Latin America today. And the way states have chosen to respond to inequality is through harsh criminalization measures and the PIC. So between 1993 and 2013, the prison population and the prison budget in Colombia quadrupled. For those of you that may be familiar, the US engaged in something that was known as Plan Colombia from 1999 to about 2015. So what was this program? This was a military aid program that was part of the war on drugs on the one hand, and also sought to crush left-wing forces in the country. So in addition to all of the military aid and the money that was funneled into Colombia to accomplish those two aims, Plan Colombia also included, and I quote, a program for improvement of the Colombian prison system. And what that was an agreement to have the US's BOP, the Bureau of Prisons, be part of designing new prisons in Colombia. So the BOP chose the maximum security prison at Coleman in Florida to be the model to be reproduced in Colombia. So 15 new Coleman max security prisons were built throughout Colombia within a time span of just around 10 years. And so just to kind of zoom out a little bit, I know that's one concrete example, but it really serves as a model of how the US has engaged in imperialist ventures and used imperialist power to spread the PIC. So just to go back to the point about inequality, if we can go to the next slide. So Ruth Gilmore has made the point that the most unequal countries have the largest imprisonment populations. So that's certainly the case with the US, where it has the highest income inequality among G7 countries. It has the world's largest prison population, right? But if we look to Latin America again, the country with the highest inequality is Brazil, which is also home to Latin America's largest prison population in both size and rate. So it's basically like the US of Latin America when it comes to the PIC. And also I would add, in electing fascists to the role of leaders of the country. So in really looking at the way that imperialism and then the exportation and the use of the prison industrial complex across Latin America, we can also see the similarities that have happened across Africa, across Asia, and the Middle East, right? So the US exerts imperialist domination, creating devastation over other parts of the world in its attempt to maintain power, hegemony, and its control of resources, right? And this, of course, is the primary reason for migration. It's forced migration, where we make a country or region unlivable to varying degrees. Then as people leave to seek out better living conditions in other places, we respond with further criminalization policies. And that happens through the imposition of borders and border security, the restriction of movement, and the detention and deportation of undocumented people within our own borders, right? So we've seen how with immigration, how that has played out in Latin America, and that has come about as a response to the US wanting to engage in a war on drugs, engage in repression of leftist and socialist forces. And the way that it has done that is through building up local repressive forces that it props up through coups, financial aid, and diplomatic support that result in devastated communities. In the Middle East and in East Africa, what that has looked like is Western-led or fueled war and intervention, right? And so those actions have destabilized Iraq, Syria, Yemen, Afghanistan, and Somalia, among others, Libya, right? And causing many to have to flee their homelands. And we can go over to the next slide. And what we see here is the response to what is quote unquote called by the politicos and the mainstream as the refugee crisis, although it is a very imperialist power-induced crisis, right? The response is that we have a turn to the prison industrial complex, right? And so here, this is just a snapshot of an article where European countries, in responding to the crisis, started looking to the state of Israel, right, in order to bolster up their border security. And we will talk a little bit about that in a minute. You can go to the next slide. So in the months following 9/11, US law enforcement began engaging in the building up of the militarization of its police forces, began engaging in the building up of its surveillance capabilities, and developing closer relationships across its law enforcement and policing agencies, as well as with other countries, right? And this was under the guise, obviously, as the war on terror. So we begin to see kind of like the contours of the rationale of imperialism. You know, we have the war on terror, we have the war on drugs, we have, and connected to that is the war on gangs, right? And it's these war on X and Y that the benefactors of the PIC use to expand their power, right? And so one of the things, to just go back to what was shown on that earlier slide, is that the U.S. also began developing or having a closer relationship to the state of Israel. It has, we know that it has long been a supporter of Israeli oppression against the Palestinian people and other imperialist ventures in the region. But Israel was really seen as an expert on fighting quote unquote terrorism, i.e. Arab and Muslim people, right? And, we talk about how the police forces in the United States started traveling to Israel to kind of train with them. And as has been shown by the two previous speakers, the US did not need to go to Israel to learn how to control and kill Black and brown people, right? The important thing here is that after 9/11, police forces really took on the war on terror and sought to expand their connections and collaborations with international forces of repression, right? And so, in looking at this slide, you see that US troops are virtually everywhere. And so when I said that the US military is like the world's top cop, that is not hyperbole, right? And here you see the close relationships between the PIC and imperialist ventures. But if we can go to the next slide. So here, it's important to understand this relationship between the US, the vast military presence, and the role of the state of Israel, and the broader constellation of repressive forces. So the US gives $10.1 million of military aid to Israel every single day. It has very similar aid packages and deals that it provides to other countries. The purpose of those packages to build up international kind of military capabilities is, on the one hand, for the US to maintain control, interest, and power, and to make sure that its friends are strong, right? But when we look at, for instance, the US-Israeli relationship, those funds are being used to develop weapons, technologies, tools, and tactics. And the way that the Israeli state does that is that it uses the Palestinian population as a test population, right? And so it perfects its surveillance technology, its weaponry, and then it exports that back to the US, but also to other countries across the world, right? And so the US isn't just giving this money like, oh, we support Israel, we want to give it money, right? It is actually benefiting by getting all this new and improved battleground tested technology, which is how it's built. So this is precisely why Israel, for instance, is the world's largest exporter of electronic monitoring technologies, which very much includes the growing use of ankle monitors in the US. And so we see the PIC in the US and how it is very much deeply entrenched in these imperialist relationships, right? If we can go to the next slide, and I will try and wrap up my thoughts. I always like to end on a positive note. So in talking about all this awful stuff and the way these systems function, I think it's equally important for us to talk about resistance. And we are going to talk more about resistance later, but I want to just end here, where Stop Urban Shield, this is a picture from a rally and a direct action that we organized in a coalition. Stop Urban Shield was a broad coalition of grassroots community and social justice organizations that came together against Urban Shield. And that was a SWAT team training and weapons expo that brought together local, regional, and international police military units to collaborate together, right? To learn from each other, to strengthen their relationships. And so this was part of the ongoing arc of the War on Terror. It was a counterterrorism grant-funded program. Urban Shield sought to militarize and bolster up local police, as well as international collaboration. So we waged a 5+ year campaign that successfully defunded and ended Urban Shield, which really was an emblem of this relationship between the prison industrial complex and the international imperialist relationships that exist. And so I point to that as just one way where we can be thinking and fighting locally with an internationalist scope, right, and an anti-imperialist scope in mind. And then the very last thing that I'll note is that earlier this year, Critical Resistance, along with all of the organizations on this webinar, put together we put out a COVID platform, an abolitionist platform in response to COVID. And I want to note that the last point, it's 5 points, the last one really uplifts the importance of internationalism and anti-imperialism if we are to talk about abolition. We can't talk about one without talking about the other. And so the things that we're confronting here in our communities with police, with imprisonment, with surveillance, those fights are fundamentally connected to the struggles for self-determination elsewhere. And I will pass it back to Sheila. Thank you.
Amazing. Thank you so much. Wonderful. Well, I hope all of you watching are enjoying this as much as I am right now. So we're going to move now into a chance for some audience engagement. So someone who is moderating the chat on YouTube is going to drop in a link to Mentimeter, which will ask a question, 2 questions, that we would like you all to answer. So the first question is, what are examples of these 3 projects as they appear today? And so those projects, again, are settler colonialism, racial capitalism, and imperialism. And the second question we're curious about is, what liberation projects do you know of in response to these? So again, like Mohamed finished up, where are you seeing the resistance? Because as Woods told us, repression breeds resistance, right? So we've got those coming in the chat. And we're going to take a 10-minute break for folks to fill those out, right? And then we're going to come back and be able to hear from what you all thought. And then we will be going to Tynetta to hear about the awesome work happening with BYP 100. And we'll have a live question and answer session at the end. All right. Thank you so much.
Perfect.
That's perfect. Thank you.
Thanks so much, John.
All right, welcome back, everyone. Thank you all. You all wrote such beautiful answers. Thanks for engaging with the questions. So I think we're able to share some of the answers up on the screen. And I just wanted to take a minute and reflect on some of these. And I'd also invite panelists, if there are other responses that really stood out to you or you'd like to respond to, please feel free. So the first question was, what are 3 examples of the settler colonialist, racial capitalist, and imperialist projects as they appear today? And folks gave great answers, such as seeing gentrification, war making, controlling land, and U.S. police trainings across the world. Someone shared settler colonialism exists not only in the repression of Native peoples in the U.S., but also the spread of capitalism in the global South. Racial capitalism exists in redlining and environmental racism and imperialism in U.S. foreign policy. And someone else brought up racial capitalism shows up in the exploitation of essential workers in the age of COVID. Yes, I think that there could not be a more stark example in this moment, right? And also seeing settler colonialism in the persistence of residential segregation. And several folks mentioned seeing imperialism present in the forced sterilization of people imprisoned in ICE detention. So thank you so much for those examples of the current projects as they show up today. Before we turn to examples of resistance, other panelists, are there answers that you wanted to react to from that?
Just that I appreciate the point about the essential workers. I'm glad that somebody said that.
Yeah, I also appreciate great segregation. Can you hear this better?
A little better.
Just saying that I appreciate all the points, but particularly the one about racial segregation and housing, because I think it kind of points right that these projects of racial capitalism also relate to land and how land is sort of organized and controlled and how people are made to live on it. And sort of seeing kind of the past and present housing crisis as both class struggles, but also colonial struggles in the sense that they are in many ways about the land that these housing or what passes for housing often exist on.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, and how, right, all parts of the PIC are involved in that too, and how different levels of policing are involved in evictions. Yeah, thank you. Cool. So let's talk about liberation. So the next question was, what liberation projects or movements do you know of in response to these projects? So people brought up really great examples, talking about indigenous resistant movements in Guatemala, speaking out in the name of self-determination to resist exportation of U.S. border policies, hashtag land back initiatives, right? We've been seeing that coming up. Massive protests globally, right? Yeah, we're kind of in a moment of mass liberation project right now. Yeah, and mutual aid. Someone brought up the rise of mutual aid networks as we're thinking about living under COVID and continued living under racial capitalism right now. And I'm just scrolling through here. Someone else brought up the Right to the City Alliance, which I'm not familiar with. Anyone here familiar with and want to share some stories of liberation from that? And I'll look in the chat too. Awesome. Panelists, any of these examples that folks shared with us that you have reactions to?
I really appreciate whoever brought up mutual aid. Mutual aid is something that I practiced extensively this summer with BYP 100 and multiple other organizations in the city of Chicago. And it really taught me about the importance of critical and collective resistance. And I think that when we continue to show and prove with mutual aid, we can say that even though the government has not invested in us the way we need to, we can invest in each other and create wellness for each other.
Beautiful. Thank you for sharing that. Any other reactions to this question right now? Oh, Woods, I see you.
Oh, I was just gonna say that the Right to the City Alliance is like is an organization or a network of organizations that came together in the mid to late 2000s as a national response to gentrification and a call to stop the displacement of low-income people, people of color, queer communities, and young folks around from their neighborhoods. And they do fantastic work over there. So just wanted to say, I agree. Awesome.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Cool. Well, thank you all for engaging in this exercise. And like I said before, we will also have time at the end for Q&A using the chat. So now I'm going to turn it over to Tynetta to talk about liberation projects and the current moment.
Thank you so much. So before I begin, of course, this first slide here says, how do we win in 2020 and beyond? And at BYP 100, we believe that it is our collective resistance coupled with recognizing that everyone's unique personal narrative, examining the world through an abolitionist, queer, Black lens, and amplifying the voices of those most marginalized, that we will win. My name is Tynetta Mohamed, and I live on the traditional homelands of the Council of the Three Fires, or AKA Chicago. And I love Chicago, especially the South Side, which is where I am. And I think that this question is important in this current movement, where we are really in a time where it's not a moment. We are deciding to create massive changes and come together to make critical resistance against an imperialistic state. It's even more important to examine this from the idea of a decentralized lens. We currently have a movement that is decentralized. And what does it look to have a leaderless, as some people say, Black Lives Matter movement, or movement that puts an emphasis on people who are most in the margin? A movement like this is important because we don't have people who are centered or quote unquote leaders, but everyone is a leader and the movement is leaderful. And that's what our praxis is here at BYP 100. Can we go to the next slide, please? So decolonialization dismantles all forms of imperialism at all levels, and it is for everyone. This is a very important statement because when we think about decolonialization and we think about the fight that we are creating and the movement and momentum that we're creating, we have to understand that decolonialization is not just for people who are at the most margined. It is for every single person that exists. It is for a creation of a total better society. Can we go to the next slide, please? So here we see from contact to conquest. In order to create decolonialization, we have to move past the American colonialist-centered framework, or move out of the mindset of America-centered. Our movement has to be international and intentional. When we describe the contact between indigenous people of America, the first contact usually describes encounters between cultures that were previously unaware of each other. And oftentimes when we describe this in America, that is between indigenous people and Europeans between the 15th and the 17th century. In reality, though, the Americas were populated by millions of people from culturally distinct communities, and thousands of these first contacts were not really first contacts in the sense that this land was already inhabited and it already was cultivated. When we examine first contact and we examine people who are indigenous to this land, we really have to put an emphasis on the fact that Europeans are more likely to be identified by their individuality, their individual names and nationalities, whereas indigenous people are identified as groups and as whole masses. The importance of this is because nobody wants to be lumped up together. Not all the times, of course, we are family, but it erases the individuality and the distinct personhood of a person when you lump them all together and don't allow them the space to be a creator of themselves. Can we go to the next slide? This slide says, what is genocide? So the definition here is the definition by the UN. And this definition is extremely important to this further conversation about what it looks like to have a decolonialization. Most people have not seen this definition, but when we say we charge genocide, we really look in the framework of the fact that America has and continues to commit harmful acts with the intent to destroy whole or in part national, ethnic, racial, or religious groups. Genocide is not simply the physical killing. Genocide is calculated, and the prison industrial complex, ICE, and other aspects of the imperialistic society are created as a way to maintain structures of colonialization. So we charge genocide to America for the things that they have done to people in this country and across the world. May we go to the next slide, please? Domestic imperialism and environmental racism is very important to the land movement that exists within indigenous communities. So here I have 3 pictures. One is of the Stop Dakota Access Pipeline. One is of Humboldt Bay, as it is called, and another is of the Black Hills site. All 3 of these sites have been highly contested in the sense that with the Black Hills, the Supreme Court has recognized that the United States has performed domestic imperialism and taken on a space that is not their own, creating the Washington Monument, and robbed the indigenous people of their ability to life and liberty. With the Stop Dakota Access Pipeline, we talk about the importance of water and water protectors who exist as a way to talk about to remind us that we are not owners of the land and that the land is something that we are here to cultivate and share amongst each other. When we examine Humboldt Bay here off the coast of California, it is important that we talk about or Dulawa Island. it's important that we talk about the 300 members that were killed in the process of defending this land in the mid 17th century. This massacre, along with disease, disease and genocide associated with white settlers in California, nearly wiped out the entire tribe. It is people like Josephine Mandamin, a founding member of the Water Protectors movement, who left us in her physical form last year, who reminds us of the importance of and building awareness of pollution, laws that are destructive to our world, fracking, and the selling of the water. But domestic imperialism is more than just taking land. Domestic imperialism is when we strip from people their right to self-determination and their ability to set themselves in a space that they can become safe and be safe. Can we go to the next slide, please? So I'm going to go into some of the liberation projects, the current moment, and statues are falling. Currently, we're going through a large defund the police campaign. This is not new. We know that police take the majority of many city budgets. And in Chicago specifically, there are more police per capita than there are in any other city. However, we have some of the highest rates of crime. When we understand that there are intersectional issues that create the things that happen in our societies, in our communities, we know that when we defund the police, we're not going towards lawlessness, even though we still exist with lawlessness with police. We are coming to the idea that because the police take on so much in terms of funding and also in terms of positionality, they're unable to be therapists. They are unable to be mental health services or healthcare providers. Police are only taught and are usually taught the enforcement of the laws that protect property. And when they are in the position that they are in, they are not there typically to take care of people in these spaces, and especially not minority or marginalized people. Then we talk about the Land Back and Reparations Liberation Project that is happening currently. So Land Back is not a new concept. Land Back is an effort to restore stolen territories to indigenous nations, and it sets a bold standard where it's making these policies possible and moving people forward. It recognizes that white environmentalists exist, and they are here with the understanding of protecting solely the physical aspects of the land without recognizing the symbiotic relationship between land and people. The social and political liberation that we are going through right now is important because it is existing as a spark throughout the entire world. It is the fact that in 2020 there was a protest for Black Lives Matter in every single country all over the world. This is letting everyone know that people are watching and they are seeing the things that are happening not only in their country, but also in America, which seems to pride itself on this idea that it is the land of the free. Statues are falling. This picture here is of a picture in Chicago of the Columbus statue, actually right after a protest, Decolonize Zikagon, where the Columbus statue was taken down temporarily. And the statues are symbolic fixtures to fixed points in time. It is important that when we when statues are taken down, we recognize that people are using these as idols to fix point in time, physical representations of times that are destructive and dismantling to the psyche and harmful to people who are marginalized. These monuments are reminders that your colonizer has more recognition in the world than you will ever get recognition. And this is especially true for Black and Indigenous people who have been ignored in data and have been ignored in their personhood. I have a quote at the bottom by Frantz Fanon, from The Wretched of the Earth. It says, "For colonized people, the most essential value, because the most concrete, is first and foremost the land which will bring them bread, and above all, dignity." Another large movement that is happening in this time and has always been a part of BYP 100, because we examine everything from an abolitionist, queer, feminist lens, is the trans and binary LGBTQIA movement. However, I want to recognize that these names, LGBTQIA, are colonized names in the fact that they were created as a way for westernized people to structurally make distinctions between people without recognizing the entirety and humanness that people have their own fluidity and experiences. Two-spirit people are very different from people who are gay and trans, and typically are attributed to people who are Native, and are only attributed to people who are Indigenous and Native, because this is a word for Indigenous people. This is a term for Indigenous people. The importance of this is that two-spirited people embody not just feminine, but they embody feminine and masculine spirit. Can we go to the next slide, please? So this is for we're into COVID-19, the current movement dealing with COVID-19, intersecting pandemics. When we understand that COVID-19 is a part of a larger system, we know that the predetermining factor to people's sickness and the large amount of Black and Indigenous and Latinx people who have been getting sick, the predetermining factor is not the fact that some people are dispositioned with disease, but racism. Racism and white supremacy are the number one killers of Black, Indigenous, and people of color all over this world. And it is important that we create health justice and a system of healthcare that promotes care over capitalism. This is happening in this current movement. Right now, people are recognizing the need for collective wellness and collective resistance against a society that is interested not in the wholeness of people, but profit over people. We need comprehensive care models, and this has been fought for since way before my time, that listens and provides intersectional and comprehensive care models. From reform to revolution, oftentimes where we are in a space of reformation, reform is used to placate the revolution by offering simplistic changes to complex structural issues. Here I have two different pictures that are actually from Critical Resistance. They created this. And I don't know if everyone can read these. However, it talks about the difference between reform by making body cameras, community policing, more training, something that happens inside of these spaces when we look at police and police reform. However, we have to understand that body cameras and community policing is not necessarily going to make a police officer better because they're being more watched. We see that consistently, even with the surplus of cameras and other digital media tools, police are still wantonly in the street taking the lives of Black, Indigenous, and people of color. We need not reformation, but a revolution. Colonialism doesn't just colonize Indigenous and Black folks and remove the possibility of reform. It creates structures that are subsequently inhibiting to all upward growth. Therefore, reducing the funding to police and putting these funds into mental health services is important, or health services is important, so that we can create justice for people who are in need of help that is beyond what police officers are trained to do, which is to resort to violence. American justice is ingrained in ignorance to the causation of societal ills and the correlations that directly associate these ills to current Black and Indigenous death. That is very important when we recognize that America justice needs to see direct causation in order to create redress for issues that happen when it comes to Black and Indigenous bodies. This is the next slide. My apologies. The next slide, please. Here I have 4 pictures. I have Dawn Wooten here. Dawn Wooten is the whistleblower who talked about the people who have had unjust health procedures that they did not need on their bodies. And also Patricia Okumo, she climbed up the Statue of Liberty during the Trump presidency to protest the people who have been imprisoned on the border. The prison industrial complex and ICE are not isolated systems. They are overlapping interests of government and industry, and they use surveillance and policing and imprisonment as solutions to economic problems, economic, social, and political problems. The prison industrial complex helps and maintains the authority and caste system of people who get their power through exploitation of racial, economic, and other privileges. It is the prison industrial abolition that is goal is to eliminate imprisonment and eliminate surveillance that is unjust and create alternatives to punishment and imprisonment that put emphasis on people's ability to dismantle oppression and inequality that are used to of color. I put these other pictures here. One is of the Panama Canal and another is of Nicaragua. And I think these are important because when we also examine immigrant customs and enforcement on stolen land, we have to think about how the United States has enforced or created through imperialism immigration by invading Nicaragua and occupying the country for 2 decades, or overthrowing Guatemala's elected government in the 1954, by organizing the Bay of Pigs invasion in 1961, or fomenting and creating rebellions in Panama just to build a canal. I bring up a very wonderful quote that I know from Juan Gonzalez's Harvest of an Empire. Nowadays, our leaders prefer to search for the causes of crime and poverty in the actions or inactions of those at the very bottom of society. The obscene transfers of wealth over the past 40 years from the bottom to the privileged few at the top, and from much of the third world to financial elites, and he uses third world as a description term here, in the West, are all excused as the natural evolution of the market, when in fact they are products of unparalleled greed by those who shape and direct that market. According to the Bureau of Justice Statistics, Native American or indigenous populations, as it is quoted here, are incarcerated at a rate of 38% higher than the national average. And indigenous populations are the largest group of incarcerated persons per capita. Can we go to the next slide, please? All of this is just to say that our current movement is pushing that indigenous people are and should be abolitionists. It is our criminalization and segregation and containment of us as indigenous and Black people that has created deep ongoing processes that remove us from our lands and also keep us from being able to experience the true life and liberty that we should be justly given as people who exist on the lands. Indigenous resistance is created through wellness and community healing, our liberation movements, and abolition in political prisons. A specific example is from Alcatraz Federal Prison. From November 20th to 1969 to June 11th, 1971, intertribal activists came together under the Alcatraz Federal Prison to shut down the operations on the island, citing that the 1886 Treaty of Fort Laramie, which guaranteed the return of out-of-use federal lands to Native people, means that they needed to remove themselves from the space. 79 Native activists, or indigenous activists as it is quoted here, held the space despite the Coast Guard Brigade. And that is an amazing feat in the face of great colonialism and imperialism, which has gone across the world and put it under its grip. And lastly, the Black indigenous experience is important. It is important that we recognize that Black and indigenous are two polarizing identities, and that Black and indigenous bodies are often excluded from greater conversations. However, this is because of the things that have been attributed upon each one of these groups through white supremacy and racism, where our unity has not been created in the strength that it needs to be, and it can be with an understanding of solidarity partnerships as powerful, intentional, and necessary to liberation. In Chicago, we had the Decolonize Zigagong protest rally, and it was just such a wonderful display of people coming together and understanding that when we recognize our collective resistance and responsibility to one another, we can create liberation. And thank you so much.
Oh my gosh. Thank you. All right. Thank you to all of our panelists. So, folks, feel free to drop question and answers into the chat starting now. And folks will be texting them to me. And so if you see me reading my phone, that's why. and we'll go through to the panel. But I just wanted to take a moment and capture some of the things that I heard. And first of all, just thank you all so much. I'm like really feeling this in my body today. I'm like feeling my Anishinaabe ancestors and my Persian ancestors with us in this continued resistance against the PIC and moving towards liberation. Oh, and I'm just, yeah, so grateful for you all and the power in this virtual room. So from what I heard three themes. The first one is reform doesn't work, right? The practices of the prison industrial complex have always been used for these projects of settler colonialism, of racial capitalism, of imperialism. And I really appreciated what Tynetta said of we need not reformation, but a revolution, right? And also hearing this resounding message of solidarity because of the use of the prison industrial complex, and racial capitalism survives by dividing, right? And so it's imperative that those of us working towards decolonization, abolition, and anti-imperialism need to be working in solidarity. So Woods, I really appreciated that example from the 1921 Alabama coal miners strike as an example of powerful cross-race solidarity. And also Mohamed, the example of international solidarity being key as the expansion of US imperialism means the expansion of the PIC. And the final thing I heard was repression breeds resistance over and over, right? Tynetta, you brought up that the fact that in 2020 there was a protest for Black Lives Matter in every country in the world. And also, yes, there have been these centuries of attempted genocide, and we're still here, and we're still organizing. And yeah, I'm just so excited to be with you all. And I'm going to take a look here now at our questions. So the first question I'm going to ask is, how do we connect and message to the masses the struggle for anti-racism with the struggle for anti-capitalism? And whoever feels like moved to answer that question.
Sure. I can take a go at it. I think that there are lots of efforts in this moment to connect those struggles. I think that to some degree, like this panel is an example of that, but also I think if we could, I think in this moment, people are feeling the impacts of the crises of capitalism as it's currently unfolding, and a widespread pandemic, and all of this happening with really patchy, deteriorating health infrastructure. And meanwhile, we are being forced into work settings with little to no protection. People who are considered essential workers are underpaid and having to work under dangerous conditions. And then there seems to be, while little to no relief for working and poor people from the federal government, there seems to be endless amounts of money for police expansion, for jail expansion, for money to go towards large corporations. And so I know like people are, as Tynetta was saying, are feeling this and drawing these connections, I think that it is important to continue to draw these connections more deeply, both in terms of our understanding of how how these systems all work together, but also as Tynetta was saying, strengthen and connect our larger fights for liberation, better conditions and liberation, whether it be around housing, around access to land, around against the ongoing violence of the prison industrial complex and the military and industrial complex, and for abolition and liberation.
Awesome. Thank you, Woods. So the next question I'd like to bring up is, I'd like to hear from the panelists, and I know we only have a few minutes, so I'd like to hear more from the panelists about intentional Black, Indigenous solidarity groups and struggles, the principles that hold them together, and how they frame the issues of land.
That's a great question, and there's so much to address there that I don't want to take the full time. Can you hear me better now?
Yes, a little better. Just if you could speak loudly, I think that's great.
Sure. Okay, I'll try to talk loudly. And it is a topic that does sort of fire me up, so this is good. But I don't want to take up the whole time, and there's so much to address in that question. But I will say that, like for the Red Nation in particular, right, that this is, I think, a central consideration because it speaks to how intertwined decolonization and abolition are, and that for us, right, there is no decolonization without abolition, and that these futures that we're fighting for come through an alliance, a coalition of Black and Indigenous resistance, but also, right, recognizing that we've always historically also been in relationship, right, not always in solidarity. So building on those historical relationships, and the Red Deal, which is sort of our project that we want to share with people, our platform for addressing climate crisis, begins with ending the occupation, right? And to end the occupation, we have to abolish the prison industrial complex, because we've seen how these two things are intertwined, right? For instance, today. And just to end with one of the phrases from our latest position paper, communism is the horizon, queer Indigenous feminism is the way, where we say that, right, Black and Indigenous liberation are the spear that are going to sort of pierce the crisis that is the United States, and queer feminism is the tip of that spear. Pass it on from there. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Lou. And Mohamed, do you want to quickly touch on this question of being pro-union and anti-policing? How do we address police unions?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. This is a great question because it has come up in our movements, right, where there's been some momentum to actually get cops out of labor unions. And I think the understanding there, the way that we understand it, is that, as Woods really clearly laid out, policing inherently and fundamentally exists to crush labor movements. It exists to be an anti-working class force, right? And it serves the interests of power. So if you're pro-labor, that means you have to be anti-policing, right? And so cops are not workers. They're not a legitimate sector of the working class. They're agents of state violence and of capitalism, of racial capitalism, right? And so I think it's actually a really significant and powerful move that in this, latest kind of upsurge of momentum around defunding police, that we started to see some momentum and some demands around getting cops out of labor unions, which I think is great.
Awesome. Thank you, Mohamed. All right, folks, that is our time. Thank you so much to all of our speakers today and all of you watching. This was Black and Indigenous Liberation through Abolition. And stay tuned for upcoming PE series from the Abolition Now Network. Thank you.